June 24th, 1812. The sun rose over the Niemen River on the border between Poland and Russia. On the western bank, the largest army ever assembled in European history stood ready to cross. 685,000 soldiers organized into 7 corps, supported by 200,000 horses and 1,400 artillery pieces. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France and master of continental Europe, sat on his horse watching the columns begin their march across the pontoon bridges. He was 42 years old. He had conquered Italy, Egypt, Austria, Prussia, and Spain. He had redrawn the map of Europe. Russia would be his greatest triumph, or so he believed. 6 months later, in December 1812, Napoleon crossed back over the Niemen River heading west. Behind him were the frozen remains of his army. Of the 685,000 men who had marched into Russia, fewer than 10,000 combat-effective soldiers remained. 590,000 were dead, captured, or too sick and wounded to fight. A casualty rate of 98.5%, the single greatest military disaster in modern history. But the body count, as horrific as it was, does not capture the full destruction. The Russian campaign did not just destroy an army, it destroyed the economic foundation of the French Empire. Napoleon invaded Russia with 3 years of accumulated state revenue. He returned with nothing. The treasury was empty, the currency was collapsing, the economy was shattered. France would never recover. The empire had committed economic suicide in the Russian winter, and the consequences would echo for 50 years. To understand why Napoleon invaded Russia, you must understand the economic war he was already fighting against Britain. By 1812, France and Britain had been at war for 9 years. But this was not traditional warfare. Napoleon controlled continental Europe, but could not invade Britain because of British naval superiority. Britain could not invade France for the same reason. So, Napoleon implemented economic warfare. In 1806, he issued the Berlin Decree, creating the Continental System. This was a trade embargo prohibiting any European nation from trading with Britain. The logic was simple. Britain was a trading nation, dependent on exports to Europe. If Napoleon could close European markets to British goods, the British economy would collapse, forcing peace on French terms. The Continental System was enforced across French-controlled Europe. Ports were blockaded, British goods were seized and burned. Merchants caught trading with Britain faced confiscation and imprisonment. Initially, it worked. British exports to Europe fell by 25%. British manufacturers faced declining orders. Unemployment rose. But the system had a fatal flaw. It hurt continental Europe as much as it hurt Britain. European industries depended on British imports. Cotton mills needed British cotton. Manufacturers needed British machinery and tools. Merchants needed British credit and shipping. And when these were cut off, European economies contracted. Smuggling became endemic. French merchants themselves violated the embargo, secretly importing British goods and bribing officials to look the other way. And Russia, the largest country in Europe, refused to fully comply. Tsar Alexander III had initially supported the Continental System, but by 1810, the Russian economy was suffering. Russian timber, grain, and naval stores were traditionally exported to Britain. The embargo cut off this trade, devastating Russian landowners and merchants. In 1810, Alexander opened Russian ports to neutral shipping, effectively allowing British goods to reach Russia through intermediaries. This was a direct violation of the Continental System. Napoleon could not tolerate this. If Russia broke the embargo, other countries would follow. The entire economic strategy against Britain would collapse. So Napoleon decided to invade Russia, not primarily for territorial conquest, but to enforce economic compliance. Russia had to be forced back into the Continental System, or destroyed as an example to other potential violators. This was economic logic dictating military strategy, and it would prove catastrophic. Napoleon began planning the invasion in 1811. He assembled an army unlike anything Europe had ever seen. 685,000 men drawn from France, Poland, Italy, Germany, Austria, and other subject states. This was not just a French army. It was a pan-European force representing the entire empire. Approximately half were French. The rest were allied or conscripted troops from territories Napoleon controlled. The logistical challenge was immense. An army of 685,000 consumes approximately 1 million pounds of food and 3 million pounds of animal feed per day. Moving this much supply required thousands of wagons, tens of thousands of draft animals, and hundreds of tons of fodder. Napoleon's solution was to carry 30 days of supplies and then live off the land. The army would forage from Russian farms and villages, supplementing carried rations with requisitioned food. This strategy had worked in previous campaigns in Germany, Austria, and Italy. Those regions were densely populated with prosperous agriculture. Requisitioning enough food to feed an army was possible. But Russia was different. The population density was far lower. Farms were spread across vast distances. Villages were smaller and poorer. There simply was not enough surplus food to feed 685,000 men. Napoleon's logistics officers warned him. They calculated that the army would run out of food within weeks unless supply lines could be maintained over hundreds of miles of poor roads through hostile territory. Napoleon dismissed the concerns. He believed the campaign would be short. Russian forces would be defeated in 1 or 2 major battles near the border. The Tsar would sue for peace. The army would return to Poland before winter. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The Grande Armée crossed into Russia on June 24, 1812. The Russian strategy, developed by General Mikhail Kutuzov, was simple: retreat. Russian forces refused to engage in decisive battle. They fell back, destroying crops and supplies as they went. This scorched earth policy denied the French army the food it needed to survive. Within 2 weeks, the logistical system began breaking down. Supply wagons could not keep pace with the advancing army. Horses, underfed and overworked, began dying by the thousands. Soldiers foraged aggressively, stripping every village they passed, but there was not enough food. Men began starving even as the army advanced unopposed. By early August, Napoleon had lost 100,000 men without fighting a major battle. Most died from disease, starvation, and exhaustion. Desertion rates climbed as soldiers realized the campaign was turning into a death march. Napoleon pressed forward. On September 7th, at Borodino, the Russian army finally stood and fought. The battle was brutal. 70,000 casualties in a single day, the bloodiest battle of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon won tactically. The Russians retreated, but the victory was meaningless. The Russian army remained intact, and Napoleon's losses could not be replaced. On September 14th, Napoleon entered Moscow expecting to find supplies and shelter. Instead, he found an empty city. The Russians had evacuated. And that night, Moscow began burning. The fires were likely set deliberately by Russian authorities. Within days, 3/4 of the city was destroyed. The food warehouses burned. The shelter Napoleon needed for his army went up in smoke. Napoleon waited at Moscow for 5 weeks, hoping the Tsar would negotiate. Alexander refused. He would not make peace while French forces occupied Russian soil. On October 19th, with winter approaching and supplies exhausted, Napoleon ordered the retreat. The retreat from Moscow to the Polish border, a distance of approximately 1,000 kilometers, was one of the greatest catastrophes in military history. The Grande Armée was already weakened by months of malnutrition and disease. Now it faced the Russian winter with inadequate clothing, no shelter, and no food. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Snow began falling. The roads turned to mud, then froze solid. Thousands of men froze to death each night. Russian forces, reinforced and reorganized, harassed the retreat constantly. Cossack cavalry picked off stragglers. Artillery bombarded the columns. The French had no capacity to fight back effectively. Discipline collapsed. Units disintegrated. Officers abandoned their men. Soldiers threw away their weapons to lighten their load. The army transformed into a mob of freezing, starving refugees fleeing westward. The most infamous moment came at the Berezina River crossing in late November. The river was partially frozen, not solid enough to walk on, but thick enough to prevent boats. Engineers built 2 pontoon bridges under constant Russian artillery fire. Approximately 40,000 men were still with Napoleon at the Berezina. They had to cross, while Russian forces closed in from 3 sides. The crossing took 3 days. Thousands drowned when ice broke or when they were pushed off the overcrowded bridges. Thousands more were killed by Russian artillery. The survivors left behind approximately 10,000 frozen corpses on the riverbanks. By early December, when Napoleon crossed back into Poland, his army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Of 685,000 men who invaded Russia, approximately 400,000 were dead. Another 100,000 were captured. Approximately 175,000 had deserted or were too sick to continue. Fewer than 10,000 remained fit for combat. But the human cost, staggering as it was, represented only part of the destruction. The economic cost would cripple France for decades. The Russian campaign consumed resources on a scale unprecedented in French history. The direct military expenditure was approximately 450 million francs. To put this in context, the entire annual revenue of the French government in 1812 was approximately 150 million francs. The Russian campaign cost 3 times the government's yearly income. This money went to equipping the army, purchasing supplies, paying soldiers, and maintaining supply lines. All of it was lost. In addition to the monetary cost, France lost physical capital that could not be easily replaced. 200,000 horses died in Russia. These were not just military animals. They represented a significant portion of France's total horse population, used for agriculture, transportation, and commerce. Replacing 200,000 horses would take years and enormous expense. In the meantime, agricultural productivity fell, transportation costs rose, and economic activity contracted. 1,400 artillery pieces were lost, either captured by Russians or abandoned during the retreat. These represented decades of accumulated military investment. French arsenals and foundries could not replace this equipment quickly. Tens of thousands of wagons, tons of equipment, uniforms, weapons, medical supplies, all lost. But the deepest damage was to France's credit and currency. Napoleon had financed the Russian campaign partly through current revenue, but largely through debt. The French government issued bonds and printed assignats, the paper currency backed by confiscated church lands. When the army was destroyed and the investment lost, bondholders realized the French government could not repay its debts. Confidence in French bonds collapsed. Interest rates spiked. The assignat currency, already inflated by years of overprinting, lost value rapidly. By 1813, assignats were worth approximately 5% of their face value. Hyperinflation destroyed the savings of the French middle class. The government tried to raise new revenue through taxation, but the French economy was contracting. Tax collection fell even as rates rose. France entered a debt spiral. Falling revenue meant larger deficits. Larger deficits meant more borrowing and money printing. More borrowing and money printing meant inflation and higher interest rates. Higher interest rates made debt unsustainable. By 1814, the French government was effectively bankrupt. And this financial collapse directly caused Napoleon's final military defeat at Waterloo. After escaping from exile in Elba in 1815, Napoleon returned to France and rapidly rebuilt an army. But he could not rebuild the treasury. At Waterloo on June 18, 1815, Napoleon's cavalry was outnumbered and outmatched by British and Prussian forces. The reason was simple. France could not afford to purchase enough horses. Before the Russian campaign, France had one of the largest cavalry forces in Europe. After Russia, the horse population was decimated and the treasury was empty. Napoleon's artillery at Waterloo was also inferior in number and quality to what he had fielded in earlier campaigns. Again, lack of funds. The French soldiers at Waterloo were brave and well-trained, but they were poorly equipped and undersupplied compared to earlier Napoleonic armies. Napoleon lost at Waterloo not because of tactical mistakes, but because France was bankrupt. The Russian campaign in 1812 had destroyed the economic capacity to wage war in 1815, and after Waterloo, France's economic problems continued for decades. The post-Napoleonic French economy entered a long period of stagnation. GDP growth from 1815 to 1850 averaged less than 1% annually, far below British and German growth rates. French industry struggled to compete. The loss of horses and the depletion of capital during the Napoleonic Wars left France at a disadvantage during the early Industrial Revolution. The French government remained heavily indebted. Debt service consumed a large share of government revenue, limiting investment in infrastructure and education. Political instability, driven partly by economic distress, plagued France. Revolutions in 1830 and 1848 were fueled by unemployment, inflation, and frustration with economic conditions. It was not until the Second Empire under Napoleon III, in the 1850s and 1860s, that France began sustained economic modernization. And even then, France never regained the relative economic dominance it had enjoyed under Napoleon I. The Russian campaign was the turning point. It transformed France from the wealthiest and most powerful state in continental Europe to a declining power struggling with debt and stagnation. Now let me show you the pattern. Napoleon's invasion of Russia was not primarily a military blunder. It was an economic decision with catastrophic military consequences. Napoleon invaded to enforce the Continental System, an economic blockade against Britain. He believed that economic dominance required controlling trade across all of Europe. To achieve this economic goal, he committed resources far beyond what France could afford. He assembled an army that consumed 3 years of government revenue in 6 months. When the campaign failed, France lost not just the invested resources, but also its ability to raise future resources. The debt crisis and currency collapse destroyed French credit for a generation. This is the pattern of imperial overreach. Empires expand to control resources or trade routes. The expansion requires military force. The military force costs more than the economic benefit gained. The treasury is depleted, the currency collapses, the empire falls. Rome did this when it overextended into Germania and Parthia. The cost of maintaining distant frontiers exceeded the tax revenue they generated. The result was currency debasement, inflation, and eventual collapse. Spain did this in the 16th and 17th centuries. Gold and silver from the Americas funded military adventures across Europe, but the wars cost more than the gold generated. Spain ended the period bankrupt despite controlling the richest mines in the world. Britain did this in the 20th century. The cost of World War I and World War II exceeded Britain's economic capacity. Despite winning both wars, Britain emerged bankrupt. It was forced to dismantle its empire. The United States is doing this now, maintaining military presence in over 150 countries and engaging in continuous wars in the Middle East and Central Asia costs trillions of dollars. The national debt has grown from $5 trillion in 2000 to $35 trillion in 2025. This is not sustainable. At some point, the economic cost of maintaining global military dominance will exceed the economic benefit. The treasury will be depleted. The currency will collapse. The pattern is always the same. Empires overextend. They commit resources to projects that do not generate sufficient return. They finance the gap with debt and currency debasement. Eventually, the system collapses. Napoleon learned this in Russia. 685,000 men marched in, 10,000 returned. And France was bankrupt. The lesson was not learned. 50 years later, Napoleon III made similar mistakes in Mexico. A century later, Germany overextended into Russia, again with similar results. And today, empires continue to repeat the pattern, believing that their case is different, that their technology or strategy will avoid the historical outcome. It never does. The mathematics of imperial overreach are structural, not accidental. When an empire spends more on military expansion than it gains in economic resources, bankruptcy is inevitable. The only question is timing. Napoleon crossed into Russia with 685,000 men and 450 million francs. He returned with 10,000 men and an empty treasury. The bodies were buried. The economic consequences lasted 50 years. That is the real cost of the Russian campaign. Not the dead soldiers, but the dead economy that could not recover. And the pattern is running again right now in 2025. Different empire. Same mathematics. Same inevitable result. 685,000 entered. 10,000 returned. And the empire never recovered. The answers are not in the military history books. They are in the treasury ledgers, showing 450 million francs gone and nothing to show for it.